Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Kohli, and Dr. Chenoy, and of course, distinguished guests. The world in 2050 seems a long way away. But clearly, we need to anticipate what will happen. We need to prepare for it. We need to do a lot of work, both in terms of fixing underlying economic problems, but also fixing issues of global governance. And I think there couldn't be a better analysis of what we need to think about than this work, which is quite thick, 450 pages or so, but well worth the investment in reading it. I think in his introductory essay, Dr. Kohli lays out a number of issues which we need to think about, and I think they largely cover the gamut. Demographics, urbanization, trade, the globalization of finance, the rise of the middle class, and some would argue even the fall of the middle class, competition for resources, climate change, technological progress, the rise of new nations, the emergence of fundamentalism, and non-state actors. Clearly, these are all issues that we need to think about today. We need to think about some of these are problems, some of these are emerging solutions, and we need to understand how we move forward. The book paints on a vast canvas and has a very impressive set of authors, as you've already heard, ranging from two of the gentlemen on the stage to people like Horst Kohler and Michel Camdessous. Now, 35 years is a long time, and that's what the book is looking forward to. And one way of thinking about what could go right and what could go wrong in the book's analysis is to think about what kinds of predictions we made in the 60s and the 70s about today. I would argue that very, very few people focused on some of the things we're thinking about today. They focused more, if you remember, the age of space travel had started. So a lot of people were talking about colonizing Mars. Some people thought about colonizing the seabed and having vast cities because we were running out of space on land. There were limits to growth. We were going to run out of the ability to grow food, and so we had to find new ways of growing food, and perhaps the seabed was a place we would go to. So these were the kinds of thoughts people had when they were asked to project 50 years ahead. And clearly we have gone nowhere near Mars, and there are only a few places where we've dared to go on the seabed. Where we have gone, however, is something that simply wasn't thought of at that time: new virtual worlds, where people spend a huge amount of time, where many of us spend 2 or 3 hours a day, and an emerging virtual reality, which means we don't really leave the chair we're sitting on, but we travel vast distances to new worlds. And clearly this is something that plagues all future casting, so to speak, especially over long periods, that enormous changes can take place that one has absolutely no idea about. What Donald Rumsfeld referred to as unknown unknowns. So in some sense, any such endeavor first, it's extremely important that we do it, but what we're likely to get right is the next 5 years. And what we're likely to get quite wrong is the 30 years beyond that, because the next 5 could be a linear extrapolation of the issues we're dealing with just now. But beyond that, whole new arenas of both solutions as well as problems may open up that we have absolutely no idea about. I'll come to what that means about governance in a little while. But if you're thinking about nonlinear change, what are the things that might happen? And here I am going to go back to the fact that I cannot think of what might happen, so I'm going to extrapolate a little linearly from what we know today. What's the big question of the day? It's really how technology is going to impact work. We have flexible manufacturing, we have big data, we have robots, we have connectivity. And this creates enormous anxiety in the industrial world. Enormous anxiety because there are at least two sources of threat. One is that, the guy sitting in Bangalore may take your job. That certainly was the worry a few years ago in the United States. But the emerging threat is it's not the guy in Bangalore, it's the robot next door which is going to take your job. And this creates enormous anxiety in the middle class, and you can see it expressed in the political dialogue that is taking place both in the United States as well as in the run-up to Brexit in Britain. The broader problem is there's a sense that middle-class jobs are disappearing, either because of technology or because of globalization, and as a result, something has to be done. And nobody quite knows what, but the populists are saying we have the answer. Keep out the immigrants. I don't know what they say about technology, but presumably keep out the robots also, and somehow we will keep and preserve these jobs. So there is a very lively debate going on, but I would argue that increasingly the debate is also moving to emerging markets, where there's a worry that perhaps the industrial countries will get it right this time and won't need us to produce stuff. What happens if, with all these robots, with flexible manufacturing, with 3D printers, with all the design capabilities that they have, that they no longer need the mass production that was the ladder to growth in emerging markets? That we used to have, every country set out first making textiles, apparel, moving up to simple assembly of electronic products, and then moving up to along the ladder of growth to higher order products. This is the famous Samuelson, Dornbusch-Fisher-Samuelson ladder. But what if that ladder is taken away? What will happen to countries like Vietnam, like India, like the Philippines, and like many countries in Africa, if that ladder for steady growth is in fact removed, because the export-led facet that enabled many countries to move forward is just taken away because industrial countries can produce on their own more cheaply than they used to be able to do it. So this is as far as production goes. But the hollowing out of production also raises the issue. So if in fact we don't have middle classes in both industrial countries as well as emerging markets, it raises the question, how do we deal with the issue that certainly at the upper end people seem to be doing fine and will do fine in an economy which emphasizes talent, innovation, and so on, but people at the middle and lower end will in fact not do so well. Perhaps they'll manage even at the lower end because the job of a gardener, of a cook will still be around, the job of a security guard, but not the middle class jobs of clerks, of factory workers, and so on. Now, people sometimes see this as just a problem of incentives and distribution, or see this as a problem of distribution, which is why you have these new initiatives of a minimum wage for everybody, which was just turned down in Switzerland. But is it just a problem of distribution? If in fact you're going to keep a whole workforce, you're going to pay them to just exist without work, What kinds of social problems does that create? Moreover, if you're going to do it by taxing the people at the upper end an enormous amount, what kinds of incentive problems does that create? Do we go back to the 60 and 70% levels of taxation that we had in the 60s and the 70s? And what does that do for innovation? So we have to think about this, all this in a complete fashion. And I think the book sort of lays out some of these possibilities, but we need to explore them in great depth. Now, these are, I've talked about problems which come from nonlinear changes, but there are also solutions which can come from nonlinear changes. And again, solutions may be right around the corner. Think of what happens if you can get cheap solar energy. I'm talking solar just for the sake of example. But once you get cheap solar energy, and we're close, I mean, even in India, we find today that people are willing to sell solar at 4.5 rupees a unit, and presumably with technological innovation, it gets even cheaper still. Now, solar energy is plentiful, right? And it's non-polluting, it just needs land, and perhaps even that we can solve by putting a lot of it on sea. But if in fact we get cheap solar energy, we immediately solve another problem which is plaguing us, which is water. Because you can have enormous desalination plants using the energy. Desalination requires tremendous energy. But if you have desalination plants, you can generate water from that. So water. Once we have water, we also, large places which are arid, which cannot support life today, become flourishing areas where in fact you can generate new land, new areas where people can live. And it may be a source of considerable growth in the world economy today if in fact we can do all this. And we could be that close. And it would of course solve the larger problem that we're all worried about climate change. That if in fact we can get non-polluting sources of energy coupled with cars that run on electricity, cars that run without drivers so that our roads don't get clogged because now nobody has to worry about what the other fellow is going to do. It solves an enormous number of problems, including congestion in cities, etc., etc. So while one might worry about some of the adverse consequences of nonlinear change, there's also a possibility of tremendous good being done by nonlinear change. Now, one of the hardest things, however, over 35 years to think about is politics. We have been, over the last so many years, blessed with the absence of war. Of course, there have been wars, but nothing on a huge scale, nothing which has taken an enormous toll. It wasn't the case in 1950. We just had been through 2 enormous world wars which had destroyed large parts of the world and killed many, many people. So the question when we're projecting 35 years forward is, should we take the most recent 60 or 70 years as evidence that we finally learned to avoid war on a large scale? Or should we worry about the fact that we've just been lucky? And what Montek writes about in his piece, I'm going to pronounce this Thucydides principle, that with new powers emerging, there's always the possibility of wars. And with the growth that Harinder talks about, that is going to take place over the next 35 years, new countries are going to emerge. They're going to create new political equations, and some of that is not going to be all peaceful. So what happens if there's a war? And war is always a nonlinear event and can change everything dramatically. And I think this is hard to think about. I remember when at the fund we were trying to project African growth, we always over-projected growth underprojected the downturns simply because one or the other country always went into civil conflict during the period, and growth went from plus 5 or 6% to negative 25%. And that put all your projections off. Now, that happened on a small scale because these were internal small wars in Africa. But what if there are larger wars, and they can do substantial damage to projections? We already see worrisome signs because of some of the factors we talked about, I talked about earlier, of the emergence of populists who have easy answers. And the distance from populism to something more worrisome is not that far. It has happened before, and the worry is that if large parts of the middle class become disempowered and are looking for easy solutions in country after country, could it create the conditions for more political turmoil? This is a question rather than a statement. It's something that we have to think about when we're looking forward 35 years. The other thing that we tend not to understand as well is social or behavioral change. And that too can have dramatic effects in different economies. Over the last 60 years, I would argue that perhaps the single most important social change in many countries has been the emergence of women into the workforce. Over the next 30, 40 years, what will it be? Will it be a change in attitude towards immigrants, that is just extrapolating what we see most immediately, a reduction in the mixing and the mingling that has been taking place over the last 60 or 70 years? Will it be a change in the attitude towards the elderly? Because the elderly will want to participate as people lived into their 90s on a regular basis. They would want to stay in the workforce much longer than they're staying today. Today, you move up the corporate ladder and you retire at your peak. But if you're going to go on till you're 80 and 85, rather than retiring at 60, should we see corporations where you go up and then come down? As you get older, you're still capable of working, but perhaps you want a somewhat quieter life than when you were CEO, and you move down the corporate hierarchy as you get older rather than... That's a change. We're not equipped for that kind of change. We haven't seen that kind of change. It's something that may well happen. How do you deal with elderly populations? How do you deal with the fact that a smaller and smaller proportion of population supporting larger and larger proportion of elderly? These are the kinds of questions which will also prompt social change. We may also find, and this is the point, when Keynes was writing his economic prospects for our grandchildren in the 1920s, when Keynes was writing that, he made a very prescient statement. He said, 100 years from now, per capita GDP will be about 4 times what it is when he was writing in real terms. And he was absolutely right. It's about that much that it has increased over that period. And he said the problem will be that people will have so much. The issue will be how to live a life of leisure. And most people will not know how to do it because they've got so used to working. How do you move from a life where your work defines you to a life where leisure defines you? Now, we're not quite there. We all seem to still find the reason to work, but there are some countries, France still recently, where they seem to be moving towards a life which is more full of leisure, the 35-hour work week and so on, than work. They seem to be moving back to work rather than leisure. But it is something that countries will have to think about. How much work is enough? And when coupled with things like climate change and so on, you might think that working beyond a certain amount, earning beyond a certain amount, consuming beyond a certain amount is actually detrimental. And we may be happy with less consumption, and maybe our sociology, our philosophy will move towards justifying that than justifying more work. Anyway, I think I've far exceeded the 10 minutes I was supposed to speak. The point is that this is a great work given what we know now and projecting forward based on very careful analysis. It does raise a very important issue. Given all the problems that we have today, how do we alter global governance? How do we alter global governance to accommodate the important countries such as India, which are growing stronger economically by the day and growing relative to the industrial countries? How do we take cognizance of the fact that the world is much more integrated and therefore policies across countries have many spillovers, and today we really don't have a system for coordinating these spillovers. Each country does what it has to, and other countries have to accept that and accept the consequences. So how do we change global governance to accommodate a world which is much more integrated, where resources are much more shared? And this kind of anxiety, this kind of question about the integrated world comes at a time when in a number of countries people are asking, are we already too integrated? So we don't have a global system of governance. The existing system is not working as well as it should. There are many actions which are uncoordinated, which create spillovers. But even while that is a concern for a number of countries, there are countries which are looking out and saying maybe we shouldn't be so integrated. And this is the debate, for example, in the Brexit debate that's going on in England. Have we given up too much sovereignty? Should we go back? So how do we work a better governed world when in fact there's enormous resistance because of some of the political forces that are taking place to more shared governance? Even as the emerging markets want a greater share of power, some of the industrial countries want international institutions to be less powerful and less intrusive. And this is something that needs to be taken care of. Let me end with one last point, which is that one of the worries we have to have when we think about the future is, yes, there are many issues, yes, there are many problems, but do we have resilience in the world economy to deal with it? Are we capable of absorbing the blows if in fact something adverse happens? And one of the sort of factors that helps resilience is variety. Yes, if you have one entity which is weak relative to the shocks that happen, that entity may go down, but there are other entities, because of differences in the way they're constituted, which can be immune to that shock and can persist. But this is where one of the questions we have to ask ourselves about the possibility of adaptation is that we've seen a convergence in systems across countries. We're all moving to this Fukuyama's end of history. We've moved towards a common kind of system, perhaps through the pressure of markets, perhaps through the pressure of financial markets. But across the world, the kind of system we have is generally a liberal market democracy. Yes, there are exceptions, but many countries moving towards this. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, this seems reasonable for most countries, but does that create greater vulnerability? Greater vulnerability when shocks occur. Why is it that there's populism rising across a number of countries, a number of industrial countries at the same time? Is it that we have common systems so that a shock such as a technological shock or a shock in terms of globalization creates the same response in different countries? And as a result, we become more vulnerable, less had a variety of systems competing across the world. We were less vulnerable at that time to sudden dramatic change. I leave this again as a thought, but it's certainly this book, I urge everyone to read it It creates a lot of it raises a lot of interesting issues, and certainly there's a lot of very interesting and valuable analysis which will help us in the years ahead. Thank you very much for doing it.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.